Ambassador, in this moment I need to close a list of the questions and ask last 5 our colleagues to speed it up. And the first in line is Mr. Арташес Гегамян from Armenia. Please, sir, you take the floor.
Уважаемый господин генеральный секретарь, выступая на полях конференции в Вене «Дни безопасности в ОБСЕ», и сегодня вы сказали, что Нагорно-Карабахский конфликт не подлежит урегулированию, так как каждая из сторон выдвигает новые условия, торпедирующие сам процесс урегулирования. Между тем, армянская сторона неоднократно заявляла, что она полностью привержена принципам урегулирования Нагорно-Карабахского конфликта, которые изложены в 4 совместных заявлениях президентов России, США и Франции. Между тем, из 3 основополагающих принципов, к сожалению, азербайджанская сторона 2 принципа полностью игнорирует. Речь о принципе неприменения силы и угрозы применения, а также о праве народов на самоопределение. Вопрос. Мы с нетерпением ждем вашего приезда в Армению и ждем новых предложений ОБСЕ, которые будут способствовать безукоснительному выполнению требований режима прекращения огня со стороны наших соседей Азербайджана. Спасибо.
Thank you. Signor Riccardo Migliori, Vice President of the Assembly.
Grazie Tonino. Brevissimamente vorrei ringraziare l'ambasciatore per la sua straordinaria attività. Vorrei porgli questa domanda. Non pensa che uno dei migliori esempi di cooperazione tra Assemblea parlamentare e il segretariato generale sia stato proprio il Kosovo? Perché anche noi come Assemblea parlamentare abbiamo registrato una scarsa capacità della nostra informazione e dell'informazione complessiva sul fatto che l'onorevole Mekhaci è stato un grande protagonista di questa fase, ha fatto la spola tra Pristina, Belgrado e Vienna più volte ed abbiamo fatto un monitoraggio molto difficile che ha affiancato il lavoro difficile soprattutto a Mitrovica Nord che è stato svolto in sede OSCE. In altri termini, sia la questione del Kosovo, sia, mi permetto di dire, il monitoraggio in Tunisia che abbiamo fatto da soli, e sottolineo da soli, sono la migliore riprova che la nostra diplomazia parlamentare aiuta e supporta, pur essendo molte volte ancora più disconosciuta rispetto all'attività egregia complessiva che svolge il segretariato generale. Mi premeva sottolineare che come Assemblea parlamentare ci intestiamo insieme all'ambasciatore Zaniero un grande risultato e molte volte in sede internazionale quando si dice l'OSCE e l'Assemblea parlamentare perdono tempo, ecco, in questo caso noi abbiamo una grande medaglia da scrivere sul nostro petto.
Grazie Riccardo. Mr. Koskinen from Finland.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'll come back to the question of the need of better cooperation between the Parliamentary Assembly and the other OSCE institutions. Mr. Secretary General mentioned some positive steps in promoting this cooperation, and in Belgrade we accepted a wide collection of proposals and recommendations in this field. But in Astana there were some problems to have this part of developing the OSCE as a whole into this declaration, and I think there are some attitude problems in the intergovernmental side. So I would like to ask Mr. Secretary General what we should do to avoid these hindrances, and would it be right time to construct a joint organ or task force to strengthen this cooperation and find the right ways to develop cooperation between the Parliamentary Assembly and the OSCE institutions?
Thank you. Signor D'Amico from
Grazie Presidente. Saluto l'ambasciatore Zanier e lo ringrazio per il grande lavoro che sta facendo. E la mia domanda è soprattutto una sollecitazione che volevo fare in relazione a due risoluzioni che furono approvate durante la sessione di Oslo del 2010 e che sono entrate, dopo la loro approvazione, nella dichiarazione di Oslo. La prima è intitolata Lotta al terrorismo, alla produzione di narcotici e agli emigranti clandestini in Afghanistan. L'Afghanistan è ancora uno dei temi che trattiamo e anche lei oggi ha trattato dell'Afghanistan. In quella risoluzione erano previste delle cose che è inutile ribadirle e ripeterle per mancanza di tempo, che però facilmente possono essere recuperate. E quindi io richiedo a lei di implementare l'attività dell'OSCE nei confronti dei Paesi membri per raggiungere quegli obiettivi che ci si davano, che in poche parole possiamo riassumere nel implementare i controlli delle frontiere di tutti i Paesi OSCE legati e che confinano con l'Afghanistan, per evitare il traffico di stupefacenti e soprattutto le migrazioni clandestine, che come sappiamo continuano invece ad avvenire e con destinazione Europa. La seconda risoluzione che volevo sottolineare è quella sempre approvata nel 2010 ad Oslo, intitolata Partenariato per l'assistenza ai rifugiati. In quella risoluzione, tra le varie cose, si chiedeva di suddividere, si chiedeva ai Paesi membri OSCE di negoziare accordi per suddividere i rifugiati che arrivano da Paesi fuori OSCE, tenendo conto anche di alcune caratteristiche come la vicinanza culturale al Paese d'origine, la vicinanza quindi del rifugiato al sistema di vita del paese dove viene accolto, in modo che possa essere e inserirsi meglio, oppure anche la densità abitativa dei paesi di destinazione, perché ci sono alcuni paesi che hanno una densità abitativa altissima e quindi difficilmente possono sostenere l'arrivo di molte persone che invece potrebbero essere accolte meglio in paesi che hanno una densità abitativa molto più bassa. Grazie.
And finally, Serhiy Shevchuk from Ukraine.
Спасибо. Я хочу поблагодарить Жана-Клода Миньона за его прекрасное выступление, за то, что он в своем выступлении затронул целый ряд очень важных вопросов. И, конечно же, у меня был вопрос к генеральному секретарю, но я смотрю на наше расписание. Госпожа Хеди Фрай готовится к выступлению. Я отказываюсь от вопросов в пользу госпожи Фрай. Спасибо.
Thank you, Serhiy. Ambassador, please, can you reply to these 5 questions as fast as you can? Thank you in advance.
Okay. The Armenian question, I see the point you make, but then, you know, a peace plan works when it's accepted by all sides. The problem with the plan you mentioned is that it's not really functioning because it's not accepted. The next step for us is to try to avoid use of force, and so we are willing to invest a lot in trying to limit the impact of crisis on the ground while continuing to engage in the political process. And I'm looking forward to the discussions I will have in the region next week. On the Italian question on Kosovo, yes, of course, but we both have the same issue. We're both involved, US Parliamentary Assembly and us as executive structures with the chair, in bringing about a success story. I think we did a great job. We did it together and interacting, and I spoke to McCarthy a number of times. So also there, the lines of communication were open. We never had any problem. The problem is how can we sell these things? And that's something on which we need perhaps to develop a corporate policy that involves everybody. The Finnish point, better cooperation. I think the bottom line there is that there's a lot that we can do, but the roles shouldn't be mixed up. In a way, the OSCE is an organization where at the end of the day, the decisions are taken in Astana. They were taken by the heads of state and government. Otherwise, they're taken by the foreign ministers. And that's the process. And if the Parliamentary Assembly wants to have a bigger role, that's not automatic. The process that leads to those decisions is an intergovernmental process. How to build a larger role for the Parliamentary Assembly is something that has lots of stakeholders in this discussion. And it's not only the chairmanship, but it's each of your governments, because they are the ones who say, well, we sit there and we determine what the policy is. So I think you have to do some homework there to try to find ways with your own representatives in the organization to find channels for you to give more inputs. The other Italian question of the two Oslo resolutions, I think both, well, on the first one, first of all, I think we have done quite a bit. When you talk about strengthening borders, within the margins that are allowed, you look at Central Asia and the border of Central Asian countries on Afghanistan, different countries have different policies. Some really rely mainly on internal national initiatives. In some cases, they seek support from the OSCE. We're working with the Turkmens, for instance, but the Turkmens have developed a bilateral cooperation with Afghanistan. We support that, but it's bilateral at the end of the day. In Tajikistan, we're doing a lot. We have the college, we're training the border guards, and we're planning to step up our engagement even further. It's a very long and very difficult border. The Uzbeks think that they're okay, and they do their own things. If they need something, they will ask us, but for the time being, they prefer to continue on a purely bilateral channel. So we intervene to the extent that we can, and taking into account what the traffic can bear, if we want to see it. The second issue, the migrations, this is a very large issue, and this would fall in the category of a question I didn't answer earlier, which is what things can we cut down the agenda of the OSCE. Migration is one of those issues where you have UNHCR involved, IOM involved, the European Union. There are a number of actors engaged there. Is the OSCE, and would the OSCE be able to provide added value if it engaged, and what would be the investment for the OSCE to start dealing with these issues in this way? I think that's a debate that needs to take place. At this moment, we don't have the tools to do that. We might have a policy, in theory, if the points you mentioned were to be agreed at an intergovernmental level, but I haven't seen even an initiative to get that agreement, even though Oslo was before my time in the OSCE. And finally, even if the question was withdrawn on Mr. Shevchuk, I would like to say that I'm really looking forward in working very closely with the Ukrainian chairmanship next year to make it another success for the OSCE. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador, for your very comprehensive intervention and answers. And I wish you all the best in proceeding our common endeavor. So want you to see next time in even better mood than today. Thank you. Now we are moving on report by the OSCE Special Representative on the gender issue, followed by a debate. So I call Dr. Fry from Canada to present her report. Please, take the floor.
Bonjour, chers amis. Je sais, bonsoir, chers amis. Je voudrais remercier le gouvernement de Monaco et mon cher collègue Jean-Charles, who was here but who left, pour la chaleureuse accueil, et aussi remercier mes collègues ici pour votre patience et support, comme d'habitude. So I want to thank you. Now, I thought I would let you know that I have a 24-page report to read. No, I'm just kidding. I will just do some highlights of the report, but I will tell you that the report is out in the hallway so that you can read it. I wanted to stress a little bit that the last report I made in the last meeting, we talked a little bit not only about gender equality, but about the fact that women are so diverse that some of their diversity have actually resulted in double and triple barriers other than simply gender. And I think we know that women have a majority status in the world, and yet they actually have all of the outcomes of a minority group, which is kind of interesting. When you think about it, women's rights are meant to be equal. Inter alia, there is every piece of supportive legislation, conventions, etc., that talk about women's equality. We know that the United Nations Beijing Conference, the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights, the International Convention of the UN on Indigenous Peoples, elimination of all forms of discrimination against the rights of persons. We have the ethnic and religious minorities conventions, and of course we have CEDAW. In spite of all of those, you can actually say that women are equal. All women, including minority women, and especially minority women, because they're covered by all of these pieces of legislation. And in fact, practically every country has signed on and supported those conventions. But de facto, in reality, women are, because of their minority status, most discriminated in, for two reasons. One, there is an inherent discrimination based on gender. I mean, let us not fool ourselves, gentlemen. You have been ruling the world for the last 2,000 years, and women have been seen as chattel. And so now that women are coming into their own and have begun to seek their rights, and let us not forget that it was only in 1995 in Beijing that women's rights were considered to be human rights, there is a long way to go. So that while the laws say that women should be equal, we do have to look at the fact that there is an inherent, because of tradition, history, etc., there is an inherent discrimination against gender. And of course, we want to talk about the double barriers of minority status, race, indigenous status, migrant status, which are all also based in historical, traditional, and cultural problems and issues. So what we see is that women are not equal in real life. And so our challenge as parliamentarians, as legislators, decision makers, and policy makers, is to try and find a real de facto way to make concrete steps to make women not only equal under the law, but to be really equal. And so we're not just talking about equality in broad strokes, we're talking about creating equality of opportunity. And if you think about it, what we have here is a vicious cycle. We have women who are unequal inherently because of their gender. Then on top of that, we have women who are unequal because of minority status, in which they tend to have low forms of education. They're the poorest in the world. As a result, they're segregated. They live in substandard housing. They're the most vulnerable. They have been trafficked especially. They have been exploited. And in terms of sexual exploitation and labor exploitation, they become addicted to substances, and of course they have a huge problem with lack of opportunity. Their life expectancy as women, minority women, are lower than the majority groups. Their health status is lower. They're most vulnerable to hate crimes. But we could, as parliamentarians, take that vicious cycle and make it a virtuous cycle. What we could do is to look at how we present and allow women to have equal opportunity by giving them citizenship, by documenting them, especially if they're migrants, by giving them their legal rights in terms of access to justice, and by looking at religious and cultural freedoms of many women. And let us also look at helping them to get real access to education, because educated women will work, they will make money, they will get out of poverty, they will bring up their children to be better educated, and therefore we have a new virtuous cycle in which, in fact, with access to health and justice, we can see women moving forward. Now, some countries in the OSCE regions have made great progress, and I needn't say that as we say that, we always look at Scandinavian countries, because indeed they have. But what we have seen, that the political, social, and economic rights and equality of opportunity for women varies greatly by regions within the OSCE. And in fact, I don't want to single out any countries, but I want to talk about my own country. In the United States, for starters, women still in the Constitution do not have the Equal Rights Amendment. And in Canada, we find that our Indigenous women indeed have lower health status, they have poorer access to justice, they are the poorest, and they're victims of violence and stereotyping. So I'm just saying that I'm not picking on anybody. We all have to look at how we, in fact, look at women's equality of opportunity and minority women, and how we deal with it in our own areas and in our own regions. And so so we're not just talking here about the demographics of the thing, I'm talking about how subjectively we view women who are minorities. And I want to pick on 4 groups very quickly and highlight them because they indeed have very good demographics and subjective outcomes in terms of how they're treated. And the first one, of course, is racial minorities. And by racial minorities, we mean Africans, Asians, and South Asians. And these are visible minorities. They're visible because they look different. If someone is Asian or they're African, they walk down the street, they're different, they're identifiably different. And so they have clearly overt discrimination. In other words, people see them and immediately their access to the workplace is barred. They're stopped at borders. Everyone asks them for documentation to see whether they actually belong, especially, and even if sometimes they've lived for generations in that area. People immediately believe that their language is inferior or they don't have any language status or their education is poor. And this may not always be true, but because of that overt difference, there is overt discrimination against people because they belong to racial minorities. And then, of course, you have to look at migrant women. And similarly, we see that migrant women, who may not always be identifiable because migrant women may look the same as everyone else, but then, of course, they cannot speak language, and sometimes they live in poverty or they're trafficked. They are often victims, and so they cannot get jobs. Quite often, they're very well-educated women. They may come from parts of the world where they have post-secondary education, they have their doctors, their lawyers, etc., but they cannot work because of language problems. They cannot get jobs because everyone immediately believes that they are not well-educated, so they face a lot of prejudice. Sometimes their own credentials are not recognized by the countries that they've moved to as minorities, so that physicians may not be able to practice, lawyers may not be able to practice, teachers may not be able to work, even though they're well-educated, and they end up working in factories, working as cleaning persons, working at very low menial jobs. They're ghettoized, and they tend to stay in those ghettos, in which case they have no ability to break out and use their education and skills to help the countries in which they're living. In some cases, migrant women are exploited by, especially when, and I know that in our country, in Canada, we don't see this, but we do have a lot of migrant women who come from the Philippines who are nurses, but who don't get to work as nurses, so they work as nannies, and they work as caregivers and caretakers in the homes. And we know that that happens throughout Europe, and we have heard stories in Europe about how these migrant women have their passports taken away from them by the people who employ them, and they keep them working at extraordinary hours, very poor labor practices, and these women cannot speak out because they're scared that they're going to be sent back from whence they came. So there is a real sense of vulnerability here. And so these women are also quite often trafficked. I want to quickly talk about the third group, that's indigenous women, and there isn't very much within the OSCE in terms of policy and legislation that looks at indigenous peoples. But indigenous peoples actually are the native peoples who lived in many lands before colonialization took place and before we saw, especially in the New World, like Canada and the United States. And these are people who owned the land, they lived on the land, they had traditional and cultural practices, and in fact, while they are protected by the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, in many countries there is no legislation protecting them, and they don't belong anywhere to any group, and they're kind of left to fend for themselves. And I'm talking here, you say, where are the indigenous peoples? In Europe, well, you know, Canada has indigenous peoples. Of course, the United States and the New World has indigenous peoples, but we know here that we have some indigenous peoples, especially who live in some of the Scandinavian countries and in Russia, who do face the inability to have land and the inability to own land, and have very few of them have treaties under the law to give them that ability to have land, so that they tend to fend for themselves, they tend to be, again, low in terms of their health status, and they tend to be able to have no ability to own anything at all, and so they're very, very vulnerable to power struggles. Many of the indigenous peoples I know in the New World, in North America, America tend to have alcohol and addiction problems. They tend to be trafficked and exploited sexually. And in fact, many of their children are born with fetal alcohol syndrome and fetal alcohol effect. And therefore, they're found in prisons a lot. They have behavioral problems, and they have no ability to be educated because they're educationally subnormal in many instances. So you look at high levels of suicide, actually, in North America in terms of indigenous peoples. Sometimes 11 times the national average. We see young people who commit suicide at large rates. There is not only a health problem, a suicide problem, but there is a whole shame base in which internally amongst indigenous peoples in their own groups, there is a great deal of domestic violence. And that domestic violence is because the men have felt shamed, they no longer belong to the land, they no longer can work, and they feel that they have nothing to do but be ashamed and pick on the women who live with them because they have to hit back at somebody. It's a natural psychological phenomenon. Of course, the children of many indigenous peoples are taken away from them by the state because the state believes that they're not capable of raising their children, obviously because they're indigenous. So now we'll want to look at the last group that I want to talk about, and that's the Roma and the Sinti. And many of you know the stories of the Roma and Sinti. In fact, we hear that sometimes in many of the OSCE countries, 90% of Roma and Sinti are unemployed. Many of them are stateless, they are transient people, they move cross borders, and of course they have very poor access to employment, to education, to economic development and success. And so they tend to be a people who are nearly always openly picked on by institutions. There's institutional discrimination where, again, they're stopped at borders, there's police violence, et cetera, against them. And so we're talking about 4 groups here that I feel are really some groups that we, as parliamentarians, should speak for. If we, as parliamentarians, don't speak for the most vulnerable in our societies, who will speak for them? That's what we're there for. We are there to make sure that everyone has an opportunity to live a better life. Now, we have made some changes in terms of those minority groups within the OSCE. As you know, there's a lot of legislation. We have a special representative for migrants. We have a special representative for minorities within the OSCE. And many of them have been doing work and collecting data, etc. And we've seen movements, especially with the Roma and Sinti in the OSCE. In fact, at Astana, there is a lot of good work being done in terms of preparing documentation and looking at helping with education and bringing in the Roma and Sinti as NGOs into making decisions. And so I think we've seen some work done in some of these areas. I just want to end by saying something. What we really need to do that's concrete as parliamentarians is first and foremost to identify the problem properly. Right now, we do have quantitative analysis, which tells us the number of people, and in some cases, we don't even have that. But we need to have that kind of data gathering disaggregated, not just by gender, but by minority status, indigenous status, racial status, Roma and Sinti, and migrant status, so that we can at least be able to track not just the people themselves in terms of the quantitative analysis, but the qualitative analysis. In other words, if we can identify and track people, we can tell how they're progressing and whether they're doing well or not. So as I said before, I'm not here to point fingers at anyone because we each can look within our own nations and find that we haven't done very many things very well. But I do think we need to look at data gathering. I think we need to involve these minority women in decision-making that would actually help them to find solutions that works for them because of their own religious, cultural, historical, and other differences, and because of internal problems of domestic violence within their own country, so some within their own communities. So some of us really need to look at how we engage them in solving problems. I think we also need to look at best practices. Some countries have done very, very well in the OSCE and some haven't. And I don't think it's because they're not able to, it's because actually we don't talk to each other very much. We come to events like this, we all say yes, we think it's a great idea, and we go back home and we forget about it all. And I think we need to think about some of that. that. We need to think about how we listen to each other, how we collaborate, and how we do some things that I think are really important. And one of the things I think really important, and at the end of the day, is the only important thing that we can do, and that is for us to develop a culture within the OSCE in which human rights would be the most important thing for us. It will be the hallmark of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe and our nation states, that we will have cared about and bring about human rights. We can look at legislation, we can look at programs, we can look at policies, we can look at ethical and moral positions, but at the end of the day, what it really needs is political will. We are parliamentarians. We can make sure that that political will occurs in our countries. And finally, this is not just about being nice. This is not about being good to people who are vulnerable. It clearly is also when you give people human rights and you give them access to the education and the tools that they need to be able to participate fully in the economic, social, political, and cultural life of all of our nation states, they will, in fact, be able to be productive and competitive members of our society. So I just want to leave you with that and hope that you will all go back and put this to work in your own parliaments, and let's come together with some concrete changes. And before I end, I want to say we did have a questionnaire that was sent out that I spoke about in Vienna. The questionnaire has been answered by 25 countries out of the 56. And so I'm saying to those of you who haven't responded, will you please do so, and will you let us know what the status is of women in your parliaments, and how are women in parliaments, regardless of their political affiliation, working together? Because I think women can work differently to make the kinds of changes we need. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Fry, on your excellent report. And now I will open and conclude debate with Madame Aknazarova from Kyrgyzstan.
Уважаемые коллеги, члены парламентской ассамблеи ОБСЕ, роль женщины в политике зависит от господствующей в обществе идеологии. Без социологического опроса явно видно, как превалирует в системе управления мужской представленность мужчин. Во всех странах для достижения гендерного равенства есть свой механизм. Нет единой модели достижения гендерного равенства. Если посмотреть опыт построения демократических институтов в странах, где есть демократические институты, созданы действенные структуры, есть министерства, есть управление по делам женщин, комитеты экспертов или советников в составе правительственных департаментов. Они существуют на национальном, региональном и местном уровнях. Как следует из вышеизложенного, по вопросам достижения гендерного равенства разные страны имеют свой уникальный опыт. Я бы хотела остановиться на примере Кыргызской республики. Кыргызская республика является одной из первых стран, которая успешно выполняет свои обязательства, предусмотренные Пекинской платформой действий, проводит последовательную политику признания прав женщин как неотъемлемую часть прав человека. Кыргызстан стал первой страной, парламент которого принял ряд законов по реализации гендерной политики. В результате принятия этих законов в Кыргызстане, в Средней Азии, одним из первых, где была президентом избрана женщина. В настоящее время Верховный суд является женщиной, Генеральная прокуратура женщина, Национальный банк республики возглавляют женщины. Представительство женщин в парламенте. У нас был и такой факт, когда в 2005 году не было представленной женщины. На сегодняшний день в результате принятых нами законодательных мер в парламенте представлено 22% женщин. Хотелось бы сказать, чтобы и в парламентской ассамблее ОБСЕ для достижения гендерного аспекта достижения гендерного баланса во всех аспектах своей работы показать представленность обоих полов. Ну, как мы видим, на сегодняшний день Бюро парламентской ассамблеи ОБСЕ также не достигает стандартов, не представлено даже 30% женского пола. Парламентская ассамблея ОБСЕ хотела бы выразить, чтобы стала образцом и подражанием, и примером, стал образцом достижения гендерного баланса в международных организациях. Спасибо.
Thank you. Dr. Fry, would you like to reply?
I actually wanted to thank my colleague because her country is one of the ones that has been improving very, very steadily and moving forward in terms of not just gender representation, but of sending people to this delegation. The highest to this convention, the highest we've ever come to at a representation of the OSCE EPA is 25% of women. And we still can see here that we have so many delegations without a woman heading it. There are very few. Turkey is one of them who has always done a good job of this, and we've seen that the Kyrgyz Republic has done very well. Kazakhstan has also been moving forward. Of course, I will not mention the Scandinavian countries because they're always made up of women, and women always head the delegation, etc. But I think we need to be able to look at each other, and you know what? Let's start a competition. Let's come to the next meeting and see which country can bring the most women, or at least 50% of women on your delegation, and let's see which one of you will put a woman as the head of your delegation. I challenge you to that.
Thank you. It was only one contribution to debate on your excellent report, of course, and dear colleagues, before we stop our work for today, I got two announcements to deliver to you. I would like to announce that Lord Bowness will chair the drafting committee which will prepare the Monaco Declaration, and another announcement, Vice President of the Assembly, Monsieur Gardetto, was telling me that there is no need to tie to wear this evening before the Meridian, or even the jacket. So it's up to you, but of course, host advised us not to wear Croatian invitation tie, cravats. So thank you, colleagues. See you tomorrow.